They say that family is the anchor that holds you steady during a storm, but nobody ever tells you what to do when your family is the storm itself. My name is Miranda, and for the last 3 years, I have been drowning in a hurricane named Jada. I live in Reno, Nevada, a city known for its bright lights and promises of easy fortune, but my life has been anything but lucky. I am 26 years old, an age when I should be planning weekend road trips, dating, or stressing about my own career. Instead, I am a warehouse manager who has spent her entire adult life raising 5 children who do not belong to me. I never imagined that a cheap plastic pregnancy test would be the sharp weapon that finally severed the bond with my flesh and blood. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you are already on your knees. I remember the moment with a clarity that still makes my hands shake. I stood frozen in the center of our chaotic living room, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed laundry. I had to physically step over piles of dirty clothes just to find a spot to stand. My sister Jada sat there on the sagging couch, casually rubbing her stomach as if she were protecting a precious gem. She looked me straight in the eye, a smug grin spreading across her face, and announced she was pregnant. For the 6th time, she hadn't held a steady job in years. Her boyfriend, Derek, was currently sitting next to her, eyes glued to the television, barely acknowledging the life-altering news bomb his girlfriend had just dropped. My stomach didn't just drop. It twisted with a sickening mix of nausea and absolute bone-deep exhaustion. I knew exactly who was expected to pay for this new addition. I had just walked through the door after a grueling 60-hour work week, my feet throbbing in my work boots, only to realize my sister expected me to sacrifice even more of my life for her irresponsible choices. I looked at Derek, who was idly scratching his stomach, and then back at Jada. I finally found the courage, a tiny spark in the dark, to tell her the truth. I told her I was done. I told her I was finished funding her lifestyle and that I would not pay a single cent for this new baby. The change in the room was instant. Her expression shifted from smugness to pure, unadulterated rage. She screamed that I was ungrateful. She threw her hands up and threatened to kick me out on the street if I refused to comply. That specific moment of betrayal was the final straw. It was the moment I realized that I had to choose my own survival over her parasitic demands. To understand why that moment broke me, you have to understand the hell I lived in every single day. At 4 a.m, the piercing sound of my alarm clock would drag me out of a fitful sleep before the sun had even touched the horizon of Reno. It wasn't a gentle awakening, it was a summons to battle. I forced my exhausted body out of bed, every muscle protesting, because I knew that if I did not start the day right then, the entire household would collapse into absolute chaos before breakfast. I would stumble into the kitchen, my eyes burning, to begin the daily marathon of preparing 5 separate lunchboxes. The kitchen floor was always sticky, covered in the remnants of a party I never attended. Derek often left a pyramid of empty beer bottles on the counter for me to clean up, sitting right alongside the dirty dishes from his late-night snacking session. I silently cursed as I scrubbed dried salsa off the table, the red stains stubborn and unmoving, because I knew he would never lift a finger to clean up his own mess. The morning routine was a calculated military operation that required me to be in 3 places at once just to get everyone ready for school on time. I would be reviewing math homework for my 10-year-old nephew Caleb, while simultaneously trying to braid the hair of my 7-year-old niece Sophie as she ate her soggy cereal. My oldest nephew Justin was the only one who tried to help. He would quietly gather the backpacks, moving with a heavy slowness, looking just as exhausted as I felt from the constant noise in the house. I moved with frantic urgency because I had to leave for the warehouse in less than 30 minutes, or I would be late for my shift. I ran down the hallway to retrieve the diaper bag and paused for a brief, agonizing second outside the master bedroom. The door was firmly locked. Jada and Derek were sleeping in there, keeping out the noise of their own children, while my 4-year-old nephew, Leo, screamed in his crib just a few feet away. It filled me with a cold, hard resentment to know that they were sound asleep in a warm bed while I soothed their crying toddler and marshaled their older children out the door. I managed to drop the older kids at the bus stop and the younger ones at daycare, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, before speeding toward the industrial district with my heart pounding in my chest. My shift at the warehouse was physically grueling. I spent hours lifting heavy boxes, managing inventory, and dealing with logistics. But honestly, the physical labor felt easier than the emotional burden waiting for me at home. At work, things made sense. If you moved a box, it stayed there. At home, everything was a moving target of chaos. I received a notification on my phone during my lunch break that made my stomach drop. It was a final warning from the utility company. I drove home in a panic later that afternoon to find a bright red shutoff notice taped humiliatingly to our front door. The electric bill was 3 months overdue. I stood on the porch, shaking with anger, staring at that red paper. I had given Jada $600 last week, specifically to prevent this exact situation. I stormed into the house and found a crumpled receipt in the overflowing kitchen trash can. It revealed she had spent the entire amount on designer maternity clothes instead of paying the bill. I felt like screaming, but I didn't. I had no choice. I logged into my bank app and transferred the money I had painstakingly saved for my next semester of college tuition to the utility company just to keep the lights on. That money was my escape fund, my future, and it was gone in a second because Jada wanted to look cute while she refused to work. The day continued to spiral downward. The high school called me just as I returned to the warehouse floor to finish my shift. My 13-year-old niece, Megan, had been caught skipping class and getting into a verbal altercation with the teacher. This was completely out of character for her. I had to clock out early, losing vital hours of pay, to sit in the principal's office because her mother refused to answer the phone. When I got there, Megan looked at me with teary eyes. She confessed that she acted out because she felt invisible at home. She said Jada only cared about the new baby. I held her hand and promised to do better, even though I was already drowning in responsibilities that were not mine. I felt like a liar promising her stability when I was barely holding on myself. I dragged myself through the front door at 7 in the evening. I found Derek sitting on the couch, the blue light of the TV reflecting in his eyes, watching sports while the kids complained they were hungry. I didn't even take off my coat before I went to the kitchen to boil water for spaghetti. It was the quickest and cheapest meal I could prepare after such a disastrous day. Jada finally emerged from the bedroom wearing her new designer clothes, complaining that the house was messy despite doing absolutely nothing to clean it. We sat down to eat the pasta, but Derek pushed his plate away with a look of pure disgust after taking a single bite. He told me the sauce was bland. He actually looked at me and asked why I had not prepared steak, since he had a specific craving for red meat that evening. I looked at this grown man, who had contributed absolutely nothing to the household, and felt a surge of rage that nearly made me scream. He had the audacity to demand a premium meal while I had just spent my education fund to keep the lights on for his video games. 3 days after Jada's announcement turned the house into an emotional battlefield, the situation escalated from passive aggression to an organized intervention led by the family matriarch. I was folding a mountain of laundry in the living room, trying to find some zen in the repetitive motion, when a heavy and authoritative knock on the door signaled the arrival of the one person Jada always called for backup. My grandmother, Grandma Lorraine, stood on the porch with her purse clutched tightly against her chest and a look of severe disapproval painted on her face. She did not come to help scrub the filthy floors or cook for her great-grandchildren. No, she came to hold court in the living room and judge my lack of financial contribution to Jada's expanding brood. Jada sat next to Grandma Lorraine on the sofa, with a hand resting protectively on her stomach, playing the victim perfectly, while Derek lurked in the kitchen doorway like a silent enforcer waiting for his cue. Grandma Lorraine wasted no time in presenting her solution to the family's transportation problem, a solution that, apparently, involved liquidating my personal assets for the greater good. She looked at me with cold, hard eyes and suggested that I sell my reliable sedan so we could pool the money to put a down payment on a brand new 7-seater van for Jada. I stared at her in disbelief. That car was my only means of getting to the warehouse. It was my only way of attending my night classes to finish my degree. I tried to explain that I needed my vehicle to maintain the job that paid the household bills. I tried to use logic. But my logic fell on deaf ears because Grandma Lorraine believed family obligations superseded personal survival. She shook her head in disappointment as if I were a rebellious teenager, rather than the only gainfully employed adult in the room. Grandma Lorraine leaned forward with a scowl and delivered the line that was clearly rehearsed before she arrived to guilt me into compliance. She said, "Miranda, you are being so selfish. Your sister is carrying a living being inside her, and you only care about keeping a few pennies in that old car." The accusation stung. It stung because I had given everything to this family for 3 years. My youth, my money, my time, my energy. But I refused to let them take my mobility. My car was my only escape route. I stood up to face them, keeping my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I said, "That is not selfishness, Grandma. That is my property. I will not sell my future to pay for Jada's wrong choices anymore." The meeting ended in a hostile stalemate. Grandma Lorraine left in a huff, muttering about my ingratitude, slamming the door behind her. But the financial violation did not stop at the demand for my car. I went to my room to calm down, my heart racing. I decided to check my bank accounts to ensure I had enough money left for gas after paying that massive utility bill. That was when I noticed a suspicious email notification from a credit monitoring service. It warned of a hard inquiry on my Social Security number that I had not authorized. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I logged into the portal with a sinking feeling in my chest and discovered a newly opened credit card account. It had already maxed out its limit on a high-end baby furniture website. Jada had used my personal information to buy a designer crib and stroller set while I was at work earning money to keep the lights on in her house. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to the gut. This wasn't just laziness anymore. This wasn't just entitlement. It was a federal crime committed against her own sister. I felt the walls of the house closing in on me. The air felt thin. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to a small coffee shop on the edge of Reno to meet the only person I could trust. My best friend Tessa was already waiting at a corner table with a look of concern. I slammed the printed bank statement down in front of her, my hands shaking so hard I nearly knocked over the sugar dispenser. Tessa worked as a paralegal. She reviewed the fraudulent charges with a sharp, professional precision that calmed my racing heart. She looked up at me and explained that Jada had committed identity theft. She told me I had to take immediate action before my credit score was destroyed forever. We sat there for an hour as she guided me through the process of calling the fraud department to freeze my credit and dispute the charges. It felt surreal, reporting my own sister, but I knew I had no choice. Tessa looked me in the eye as I hung up the phone and gave me a warning that sent a chill down my spine. She said, "You have to be careful, Miranda. If they dare to steal your identity once, they will do it again. You need a way out right now." I drove back to the house that evening with a knot in my stomach, knowing that the war had officially begun. I walked through the front door to find Jada frantically typing on her phone. She looked panicked. Her transaction for a matching changing table had just been declined. She looked up at me with confusion that quickly turned into suspicion when she saw the icy resolve on my face. I didn't say a word. I walked past her, heading straight for my room, because I knew that saving myself meant I had to stop saving her. Exactly 1 week later, the atmosphere in the house was as tense as a string about to snap. The silence between Jada and me had become suffocating. I rushed home from the warehouse, not to start my usual second shift of cooking and cleaning, but to intercept the mail carrier. I was expecting a response that could redefine my entire future. I found a thick white envelope stamped with the logo of the largest technology corporation in downtown Reno. It was sitting innocently in the mailbox, mixed with the usual stack of overdue bills. I stood in the driveway with trembling hands as I carefully tore open the seal. Inside was an acceptance letter for a paid internship in their systems analysis department. The salary offered in the document was more than double what I currently made at the warehouse. It included a pathway to a full-time engineering career upon graduation. I felt a wave of pure euphoria wash over me for the first time in years. This was it. This was my golden ticket out of poverty. I walked through the front door with a genuine smile that I failed to suppress. That turned out to be a tactical error. Jada was waiting in the kitchen like a predator who sensed a shift in the power dynamic. She snatched the paper from my hand before I could even set my keys on the counter. Her eyes scanned the document rapidly. Her expression shifted from curiosity to a twisted form of jealousy that distorted her features. She did not offer a word of congratulations. She didn't hug her younger sister. Instead, she looked at me with cold contempt. She deliberately tore the letter into two perfect halves. She dropped the pieces onto the dirty linoleum floor and dusted her hands off as if she had just disposed of trash. The ultimatum she delivered next was so audacious that it took my brain a full minute to process the sheer entitlement dripping from her words. Jada announced that I was required to withdraw from my college courses immediately. She told me to quit my warehouse job so I could stay home to manage the household full-time. She claimed that with the sixth baby coming, she and Derek needed to focus all their energy on finding suitable employment, which was a lie everyone knew they would never fulfill. Derek was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a soda. He chimed in with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He laughed at the idea of me working in an office. He told me that a woman's place was in the home taking care of the family rather than chasing foolish career dreams. The disrespect in that room was so thick I could taste it. But I refused to let them see me cry over the torn paper. I bent down to pick up the scraps of my future, while Jada stepped closer to intimidate me with her physical presence. The air crackled with hostility as she realized I was not going to submit to her demands this time. Jada screamed at the top of her lungs, so loud that the neighbors probably heard her through the walls. "You think you are going somewhere? You owe me this house. I need you here to watch the kids so I can rest. If you walk out that door, do not ever come back." I stood up slowly. I smoothed out the wrinkled paper in my hand. I channeled every ounce of indifference I had left. I looked at the woman who shared my DNA but possessed none of my values. I looked straight into her eyes and said, "You are right, Jada. I will go, and you will soon realize the price of turning the only person helping you into an enemy." I turned my back on her to walk toward my bedroom. Derek decided he needed to have the last word to soothe his fragile ego. He chuckled darkly and called out, "Come on, little girl. You will not last a week out there. You will eventually crawl back to apologize to us." I closed my bedroom door and locked it. I didn't start packing immediately because I knew they were listening. I waited. I waited until the house settled into a deceptive quiet. Then, I slipped out to the garage under the pretense of checking the laundry. The garage was dimly lit and smelled of oil, but it was the only sanctuary I had left in that suffocating property. I was startled when a shadow moved near the workbench. I relaxed when I saw Justin stepping out from behind a stack of old tires. My 16-year-old nephew looked older than his years. He had dark circles under his eyes and a grim expression on his face. He walked over to me silently and pressed a small, battered notebook into my hands. I opened it to see pages of handwritten notes detailing dates and times. He had overheard Jada and Grandma Lorraine discussing plans to sabotage my financial independence. Justin told me that they planned to report my car as stolen if I tried to leave with it. He told me I needed to get out tonight before they woke up. I looked at this brave young man who was sacrificing his own safety to protect me. I realized that leaving was the only way I could ever become strong enough to come back and save him. At midnight, when darkness covered the entire suburban neighborhood of Reno, I initiated the final phase of my departure. I moved through my bedroom with the silence of a ghost. I knew that a single creaking floorboard could wake the light sleepers down the hall and ruin my chance at freedom. I bypassed my collection of sentimental trinkets and photo albums. I understood that emotional attachments were heavy anchors that would only drag me back into this toxic environment. I focused strictly on survival essentials. I placed my laptop, birth certificate, social security card, and a week's worth of clothing into heavy-duty black trash bags. This was a strategic choice. If Jada or Derek happened to look out the window, they would simply think I was taking out the garbage rather than moving my entire life out of their house. I crept down the hallway past the master bedroom. The faint sound of Derek's snoring vibrated through the door like the growl of a sleeping guard dog. My heart hammered against my ribs with such intensity that I was terrified the sound alone would wake the baby sleeping in the nursery. I reached the kitchen door and found Justin waiting for me in the shadows, just as he had promised. He didn't say a word. He grabbed two of the heaviest bags from my hands and led the way to my sedan parked on the street. We avoided the garage door opener to keep the silence intact. We loaded the trunk in absolute silence under the dim amber glow of the streetlights. The cold Nevada wind bit at our exposed skin. I turned to look at my nephew one last time. A crushing weight of guilt settled in my chest. I was leaving him behind to be the responsible adult in a house full of children. Justin stood there shivering in his thin hoodie, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He tried desperately to maintain a brave face. He looked at the house that was more of a prison than a home, and then turned his gaze back to me with a maturity that no 16-year-old boy should ever have to possess. Justin stepped closer and whispered urgency into the cold night air. "Auntie, go. Don't worry about us. If you stay here, you will die a slow death inside these walls. I will send you a message if anything bad happens." I reached out and grabbed his hands to squeeze them tightly. I needed him to know that this separation was a strategic retreat, not an abandonment. I looked him in the eye and said, "I promise I will come back to get you and the kids when I am strong enough, but right now I have to save myself first so I can save you later." He nodded once and pushed me gently toward the driver's seat before turning back to the dark house to resume his watch. I started the car and allowed it to roll down the hill in neutral before engaging the engine. I drove through the deserted streets of Reno with tears streaming down my face, but with a sense of relief so profound that it made me lightheaded. I drove for 40 minutes to the other side of the city. Tessa had managed to secure a dilapidated apartment for me just hours before. The studio apartment was located above a noisy laundromat and smelled faintly of old cigarettes. But to me, it smelled like victory. I dragged my trash bags up the 3 flights of stairs and collapsed onto a bare mattress on the floor without even locking the deadbolt. I was too exhausted to care. The peace I found in that empty room was shattered the moment the sun came up the next morning. I woke up not to the sound of screaming children, but to the relentless vibration of my cell phone dancing across the wooden floorboards. I picked it up to see 99 missed calls and hundreds of text messages from Jada. They ranged from confused to apologetic and finally to homicidal. The sheer volume of her rage confirmed that she had woken up expecting her morning coffee and unpaid nanny, only to find an empty room and a cold stove. I ignored the calls and pressed play on the most recent voicemail she had left just 2 minutes ago. Jada's voice shrieked through the tiny speaker with enough venom to curdle milk. "You are an ungrateful brat. I will call the police and tell them you stole my money. You will pay for abandoning this family in our time of need." I listened to the threat with a calmness that surprised me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't in the room with her to absorb the blow. I saved the voicemail as evidence and then blocked her number before getting up to start my first day as a free woman. I didn't know yet that her threat about the police wasn't just an idle scream into the void. It was a promise she actually intended to keep. Less than 48 hours after I started my new life at that rented apartment, the illusion of peace was violently shattered. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind where the heat of the Nevada desert lingers long after the sun goes down, baking the asphalt and making the air shimmer. I was sitting on my bare mattress, cross-legged, trying to focus on a textbook about systems engineering. The room was quiet, a stark contrast to the cacophony I was used to. For the first time in years, the only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant traffic of Reno. I was just starting to believe that I had actually escaped, that the nightmare was behind me. Then, the world exploded. The entire room was suddenly illuminated by the strobe light effect of red and blue sirens flashing through the thin, cheap blinds. It wasn't just one car. The intensity of the lights suggested a raid. The aggressive pounding on my front door shook the flimsy frames so hard that flecks of peeling white paint fell onto the dark floorboards. My heart didn't just jump. It hammered against my ribs with the force of a trapped bird. For a split second, I sat frozen, my textbook sliding off my lap, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Had something happened to the kids? Was Justin hurt? I scrambled to my feet, my legs feeling like jelly, and crept toward the door. I looked through the peephole, and my breath hitched in my throat. 2 uniformed officers stood there, their hands resting ominously on their holsters. They looked serious, ready for a confrontation. But it was the person standing right behind them that made my blood run cold. It was Jada. She looked like she had stepped straight out of a tragic movie. She was wearing muted colors, her hair was deliberately messy, and her face was blotchy, as if she had been crying for hours. She had somehow convinced the police to let her accompany them to the scene of the alleged crime, and she was currently putting on the performance of a lifetime in the dingy hallway of my building. She wasn't just my sister in that moment, she was an architect of destruction. I opened the door slowly. I kept my hands visible, palms open, raised slightly to shoulder height. I knew how quickly these situations could escalate, especially when false accusations were flying around. The air in the hallway smelled of old carpet and Jada's overpowering floral perfume, a scent that now triggered a fight-or-flight response in my brain. The older officer stepped forward into the threshold, his boots heavy on the floor, while his partner moved to block the exit, ensuring I couldn't make a run for a fire escape I didn't even know existed. The lead officer looked at me with a stern, unyielding expression. It was the look of a man who had already heard a very convincing sob story and had made up his mind about who the villain was before he even knocked. He wasted no time in laying out the charges that had been filed against me just an hour ago at the precinct. He cleared his throat, pulling a small notepad from his pocket, and spoke with a voice that demanded absolute compliance. "Ms. Miranda Miller?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "We received a report asking for a welfare check on a minor and an allegation of grand larceny. We have a sworn statement that you have stolen assets valued at over $10,000. You have the right to remain silent, but I advise you to cooperate fully." I was stunned into silence. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. $10,000? Grand larceny? The accusation was so much worse than I had anticipated. I thought she might accuse me of stealing a toaster or maybe the car keys, but this? This was a felony. This was prison time. Jada didn't give me a chance to respond to the officer. She saw her opening and lunged forward from the hallway, pushing past the junior officer with tears streaming down her face. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face contorted in a mask of anguish. She screamed with such conviction that, for a second, I almost wondered if I had suffered a break from reality and actually done something wrong. "Arrest her!" Jada wailed, her voice echoing off the thin walls of the apartment complex. Neighbors began to peek out of their doors, eyes wide with curiosity and judgment. "She is a thief! She took all the money I saved for my children. She stole Grandma Lorraine's vintage diamond jewelry before she ran away like a coward. Look at her. She doesn't care if her nieces and nephews starve." The accusation about the jewelry hit me the hardest. Grandma Lorraine's diamonds were the family holy grail. They were kept in a velvet box that hadn't been opened in years. To accuse me of taking them was a calculated move designed to turn the entire extended family against me forever. It was brilliant, evil, and entirely fabricated. I took a deep, trembling breath. I looked down at my shaking hands and forced them to still. I stepped back, retreating into the center of my studio apartment, allowing the officers to see the entirety of my new life. "Officer," I said, my voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "Look around." The room was almost completely empty. There was no furniture other than my mattress. There were no electronics other than my old laptop. In the corner sat 2 black heavy-duty trash bags containing my clothes. That was it. It clearly did not look like the hoard of a master jewel thief or someone sitting on $10,000 of stolen cash. "I invite you to search my belongings," I said, looking the lead officer in the eye. "I have absolutely nothing to hide. I left that house with my clothes and my laptop. That is all." I knew that my innocence was the only weapon I had left. If I resisted, I looked guilty. If I got angry, I looked volatile. I had to be the calmest person in the room, which was nearly impossible with Jada screaming obscenities just 3 feet away. The officers exchanged a look. The junior officer nodded and began to rifle through my meager possessions. He opened the trash bags, dumping my jeans and work shirts onto the floor. He patted down the mattress. He checked the tiny bathroom, opening the tank of the toilet and looking under the sink. It was humiliating. It was a violation of my sanctuary, the first place I had ever called my own, and now it was being tossed by strangers because my sister couldn't handle rejection. Jada stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her sobbing quieting down to a smug sniffle. She was smiling. It was subtle, just a slight upturn of the corners of her mouth, but I saw it. She thought she had finally cornered me. She thought that even if they didn't find the jewelry, the accusation alone would be enough to get me fired from my internship, enough to ruin my reputation, enough to drag me back to her house in handcuffs. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The only sounds were the rustling of the officer searching my bags and the buzzing of the fluorescent light overhead. I stood there, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years, asking for a miracle. And then, a breathless voice cut through the noise from the open hallway behind Jada. "Wait!" I looked up, startled. Standing there, panting heavily, was Justin. He looked like he had run a marathon. Sweat was dripping down his forehead, soaking the collar of his t-shirt. His chest was heaving, and his sneakers were dusty. He had likely hitchhiked or spent his last few dollars on a desperate Uber ride the moment he heard his mother call 911. He had chased the police cars across the city because he refused to let me go down for a crime I did not commit. Jada spun around, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She had not expected her son to follow her. She thought he was at home, watching the younger kids, trapped in the role she had forced upon him. "Justin?" she snapped, her voice losing its tragic tremor and snapping back to its usual harshness. "What are you doing here? Go back to the car." Justin ignored her. He walked right past his mother, physically brushing her shoulder as he entered the apartment. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He walked straight up to the lead officer, his breathing ragged. He held up his cracked smartphone directly to the police officer's face. His hand was shaking, whether from exhaustion or fear, I didn't know, but his voice was firm. He delivered the evidence that would shatter Jada's narrative into a million pieces. "Mom is lying," Justin said, the words heavy and final. "She is lying about everything. Here is the video I recorded last night." "Justin, don't you dare!" Jada shrieked, lunging for the phone. "He's confused. He's just a child." The junior officer stepped in between them, blocking Jada with a raised arm. "Ma'am, step back. Let the boy speak." The lead officer took the phone. He tapped the screen and pressed play. The volume was turned up all the way. In the silence of my apartment, the audio from the video was crystal clear. It was a recording taken from the hallway of Jada's house, peering through the crack of her bedroom door. The video clearly showed Jada sitting on her bed. She was holding the velvet jewelry box. In the video, she was laughing, a cold, manic sound. She was wrapping the box in a thick towel. "She thinks she can just leave?" Jada's voice on the recording was sneering. "I'm going to bury her. I'll hide this under the mattress, tell the cops she took it, and Grandma will never speak to her again. She'll be begging to come back and scrub my floors by the time I'm done with her." The video showed her shoving the bundle deep under her own mattress, smoothing the sheets over it, and then checking her reflection in the mirror to practice her crying face. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was as if the gravity had reversed. The realization hit the officers that they had been used as pawns in a twisted family dispute. They realized they had been weaponized by a narcissist to harass an innocent woman. The younger officer stopped searching my bag. He stood up, dusting off his knees, and turned his gaze toward Jada. The look on his face was no longer one of sympathy. It was one of professional disgust. The lead officer handed the phone back to Justin, nodding at the boy with a newfound respect. He turned to Jada, who was now backing away toward the stairs. Her face had drained of color. The smugness was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked like a trapped animal. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously low. "Filing a false police report is a criminal offense in the state of Nevada. Wasting police resources on a personal vendetta? That is not something we take lightly." Jada tried to stammer out an excuse. I thought she took it. Maybe she put it back. You don't understand, she's trying to ruin me." But her mask of the victim had completely slipped. Underneath, everyone in that room could see the vindictive, manipulative person she really was. She screamed that Justin was a traitor. She tried to grab him again, her nails reaching for his arm, but the officer stepped in, grabbing her wrist in a professional restraint hold. "That is enough," the officer barked. "You are under arrest for filing a false report and misuse of emergency services. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." I watched, numb, as the power dynamic flipped entirely. Jada realized that her attempt to destroy me had just handed the authorities the perfect reason to investigate her instead. As they led her out in handcuffs, she wasn't screaming at me anymore. She was screaming at Justin. She called him names I won't repeat, cursing her own son for telling the truth. Justin stood next to me, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. I pulled him into a hug, burying my face in his sweaty shoulder. We stood there in the middle of my ransacked apartment, listening to the sirens fade away, knowing that while this battle was won, the war was far from over. 2 months passed since that shameful incident at the police station turned my family's private dysfunction into a matter of public record. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that the humiliation of being caught lying to the authorities would force Jada to finally step up. I hoped it would be the rock bottom she needed to hit so she could bounce back and become the mother her children deserved. I was wrong. Without my paycheck to subsidize their lifestyle, and without my physical labor to maintain the household hygiene, the situation at my sister's house rapidly deteriorated. It went from disorganized to dangerous in a matter of weeks. The house, which had always been cluttered, became a biohazard. The police officer who had handled the false theft accusation had filed a mandatory report with Child Protective Services. He was a good man, and he had been alarmed not just by the false report, but by Jada's unstable behavior and the desperation he saw in Justin's eyes. That report triggered an investigation that peeled back the layers of neglect I had been covering up for years. I wasn't there to see it, but I read the reports later. A caseworker arrived at the house for a surprise inspection on a humid Thursday afternoon. What she found was legally defined as uninhabitable for minors. There was black mold growing in the bathroom. It had started as a small patch, something I used to scrub with bleach every weekend. But without me there to fight it, the mold had spread like a cancer, covering the ceiling and the grout, filling the air with toxic spores that no one had scrubbed in 8 weeks. The kitchen was worse. The caseworker opened the refrigerator and found it completely empty. There was no fresh food, no vegetables, no fruit, no meat. Just a few crusty bottles of condiments, a jar of pickles, and a carton of milk that had expired 2 weeks prior. The electricity had finally been cut off again because Jada refused to use her own money to pay the bill I had settled months ago. The house was dark, sweltering hot without AC, and smelled of rotting garbage. The caseworker noted in her file that the younger children, specifically Caleb and Leo, were showing signs of malnutrition. They were thin, their clothes were dirty, and they had untreated rashes. It was a heartbreaking confirmation of what I had always known. I wasn't just helping, I was the life support system for that family. And when I pulled the plug on my involvement, the patient died. And then there was Derek. If you ever wanted to know the true measure of a man, you just had to look at Derek in a crisis. He proved exactly how much his loyalty was worth. The moment the pressure from the government agencies became real, the moment he realized that staying with Jada meant he might be held liable for child neglect or forced to pay for the mounting legal fees, he checked out. He didn't fight for his family. He didn't try to find a job to fix the mess he helped create. He didn't stand by the woman carrying his child. Instead, he waited until Jada was asleep one Tuesday night, drugged by her own denial. He quietly packed his bags. He raided the house for anything of value. He took the gaming console. He took the television. And, in a final act of pathetic cruelty, he found the small stash of emergency cash Jada had hidden in a cookie jar on top of the fridge, money she had likely begged from Grandma Lorraine. He took it all. He vanished into the night without even leaving a note for the woman who had supported his laziness for years. He was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, leaving the passengers to drown. Jada woke up the next morning to find herself completely alone. The silence in the house must have been terrifying. She was in a crumbling house with 5 terrifyingly quiet children, no electricity, no food, and a court summons taped to the door. The legal hammer came down swiftly and without mercy during the emergency hearing later that week. I was subpoenaed to give a statement, but I didn't have to say much. The evidence spoke for itself. The courtroom was cold and sterile, smelling of floor wax and old paper. The judge, a woman with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow, looked at the photos of the living conditions. She read the report from the caseworker. Her expression was grim. It was the face of someone who knew there was no other choice. Jada stood there trembling. She wasn't trembling with maternal concern or worry for her children's trauma. She was trembling with the terrifying realization that her safety net was gone. She looked small, defeated, and pathetic in her wrinkled clothes. The caseworker delivered the verdict that shattered Jada's delusion of control. She stood up, adjusted her glasses, and looked Jada in the eye. "Miss Jada," she stated firmly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Based on the sanitary conditions, the lack of utilities, the malnutrition of the minors, and your unstable psychological state as evidenced by the recent police intervention, we are forced to execute an order to remove the children from this environment immediately." The gavel came down. It was a sound that signaled the end of an era. The children were placed into temporary foster care. The system, in its flawed attempt to help, had to separate them. Justin, because of his age and the specific needs of the younger ones, was separated from his siblings. This was the one thing I had tried so hard to prevent. It broke my heart to know he wouldn't be there to protect them, but I also knew he needed to be free of the burden of parenting them. Jada was not only stripped of her custody rights. The judge, clearly unimpressed by Jada's history of manipulation, slapped her with a sentence of 300 hours of community service and a hefty fine for filing a false police report against me. The system had finally worked, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a tragedy that had been years in the making. In a state of absolute desperation, Jada did the only thing she knew how to do. She tried to find someone to blame, someone to fix it. She tracked me down. I was at the corporate office where I was completing my internship. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room in the middle of a meeting with my supervisor and 2 other engineers. We were discussing a system migration plan, and for the first time in my life, I felt respected. I felt professional. Then, the receptionist called the room. Her voice was tight with panic. She said there was a hysterical woman in the lobby demanding to see me. My stomach dropped. I knew who it was. I apologized to my team, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, and walked out to the lobby. I found Jada looking like a ghost of her former self. Her hair was disheveled, matting at the back. Her eyes were manic, darting around the sleek, modern lobby like she was hallucinating. She was wearing sweatpants and a stained shirt. She spotted me and immediately dropped to her knees, right there, on the polished marble floor, in front of the security guards and my colleagues who were passing by on their lunch break. She caused a scene. "Miranda!" she wailed, grabbing the hem of my skirt with dirty hands. "Miranda, I beg you, please, tell them you will pay the rent. Derek left. He took everything. I cannot lose the kids. You are their aunt. How can you be so heartless?" She was trying to weaponize my love for the children one last time. She was using the same old guilt trip, the same old manipulation. She wanted me to throw away my internship, my money, and my sanity to bail her out of a hole she had dug herself. I looked down at her. I saw the tears, the desperation, the fear. And for the first time, I felt nothing. No, that's not true. I felt a profound sadness, like mourning a death. But the guilt? The crushing weight that used to control my every decision? It was gone. It had evaporated in the heat of her betrayal. I knew that giving her money now would not bring the kids back. It would not fix the mold. It would not bring Derek back. It would only prolong her dysfunction. It would only feed the parasite. I stepped back, pulling my skirt out of her grasp. I looked at the security guard who was waiting for my signal. I nodded to him. Then I looked at Jada. I delivered the final verdict on our relationship. "I raised them for 3 years, Jada," I said, my voice steady and calm, contrasting with her hysteria. "I gave you everything I had, but you never acted like a real mother. You acted like a child who expected the world to cater to her. This is the consequence you have to carry. I will not save you this time." "Miranda, please!" she screamed as the guard took her by the arm. "No," I said, "it's over." I turned around. I signaled for security to escort her out. I heard her sobbing, screaming my name, begging and cursing as they dragged her through the revolving doors. I didn't watch her go. I walked back toward the elevators, smoothed my skirt, and pressed the button for the top floor. I went back to my desk to continue building the future she had tried so hard to destroy. 6 months later, I stood on the top floor of a gleaming office building in Las Vegas, watching the neon lights flicker to life against the darkening desert sky. The view was breathtaking. Below me, the Strip was a river of gold and red light, pulsing with energy. But it wasn't the view that took my breath away, it was the silence. For years, silence had been a terrifying thing in my life. In Jada's house, silence usually meant someone was plotting something, or worse, that a child had gotten into something dangerous while I wasn't looking. But here, in my corner office, the silence was different. It wasn't empty, it was luxurious. It was the sound of a life finally under my own control. I had completed my internship with top marks, shattering the expectations of everyone who thought a warehouse worker couldn't handle complex systems engineering. The company had immediately offered me a full-time position as a junior systems analyst. The starting salary in the offer letter exceeded what Jada and Derek had made in 3 years combined. I lived in a modern apartment complex just 10 minutes away from the office. It had amenities I used to only see in movies, a gym, a pool, a concierge, but the best amenity was the peace. The electricity never shut off, the fridge was always full of food that I liked, and the only person I had to clean up after was myself. I had traded the chaos of Reno for the structured ambition of Las Vegas, and I had never looked back. However, just because I had left the physical location of my trauma didn't mean the news stopped traveling. It reached me through the grapevine of distant relatives, cousins who had stayed silent while I was drowning, but were suddenly eager to gossip now that the ship had sunk. They finally understood why I had left, and the updates they brought me were a grim confirmation that justice, though slow, is eventually inevitable. The first domino to fall was Grandma Lorraine, the woman who had tried to bully me into selling my car, the matriarch who believed family loyalty meant enabling abuse, had suffered a mild stroke shortly after the court hearings. The doctors said it was stress-induced. Apparently, the humiliation of seeing her golden granddaughter, Jada, exposed as a fraud and a neglectful mother was too much for her pride to handle. But here is the tragic irony. In her time of need, the person she had championed, Jada, was nowhere to be found. Jada was too busy drowning in her own legal mess to care for an elderly woman, and without my income to pay for her medications or private care, the family had no choice. Grandma Lorraine had been moved into a state-funded nursing home facility on the outskirts of Reno. I knew the place. It was known for being understaffed, smelling of antiseptic and boiled cabbage, and having flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. She had attempted to call me several times from the communal phone in the hallway. I saw the area code pop up on my screen. I imagined her standing there, clutching her purse, expecting me to answer and come running like I always did. She probably wanted to guilt me into paying for a private room, or perhaps she wanted to scold me for abandoning the family. I never found out. I blocked every single number associated with that part of my life. I didn't feel joy in her suffering, but I felt a resolute peace in my decision. She had made her choice when she sat in that living room and demanded I sell my future for a van. Now, she had to live in the reality she had helped create. My focus remained entirely on the innocent victims of this tragedy. I refused to let my nieces and nephews suffer permanently for the sins of their parents. They were the only tether I had left to that life, but I engaged with them on my terms, protected by legal boundaries. I met with a financial advisor in Las Vegas, a sharp woman who helped me establish a protected educational trust fund for Justin and his siblings. The legal terms of the trust were drafted with absolute precision. The money would unlock only when they turned 18, and it could be used solely for tuition, trade school, or housing. I deposited a significant portion of my monthly paycheck into this account. It was my way of ensuring they would have the escape route I almost lost. But the most important clause in the document was the one that barred Jada. The lawyers made sure that Jada could never access a single cent of that money. She couldn't touch it for expenses, she couldn't borrow against it, and she couldn't even see the balance. Justin was currently living with a foster family in a quiet suburb. I spoke with his caseworker weekly. She told me that for the first time in his life, Justin was acting his age. He wasn't changing diapers or breaking up fights. He was playing soccer. He was getting straight A's. The Foster family actually encouraged his academic interests. We exchanged emails every Sunday. In my last message, I promised him that his future was secure, that I was building a foundation for him to stand on when he was ready. And then there was Jada. The most satisfying closure didn't come from a courtroom or a confrontation. It came from knowing exactly where she had ended up after the dust settled on her destroyed kingdom. Jada had avoided jail time for the false police report, but the fines and the legal fees had decimated her. With no husband, no sister to exploit, and a credit score that was now radioactive, she had been forced to enter the workforce for the first time in a decade. She was currently working the night shift at a 24-hour laundromat in a rough part of town. I didn't need to see it to picture it. The image was burned into my mind by the descriptions from my cousins. I imagined her standing there under the harsh, flickering, fluorescent lights. The air would be hot and humid, smelling of cheap detergent and other people's sweat. She would be folding the dirty underwear of strangers, sorting through piles of grease-stained work shirts, her back aching from the manual labor she had always felt she was too good to perform. She looked 10 years older than her actual age. Gray hairs were sprouting prematurely at her temples, and deep lines of bitterness were etched around her mouth. She was finally living the reality of a single mother with no skills and no support system, because she had burned the only bridge that ever led to stability. Every shirt she folded was a reminder of the laundry she used to watch me do. Every dollar she earned was a fraction of what she used to demand from me. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, serving a sentence of mediocrity and hard labor. It was a poetic justice so complete that I didn't need to add anything to it. I turned away from the window, the lights of the Las Vegas Strip reflecting in my eyes. I picked up my leather portfolio from my mahogany desk. I had a meeting in 5 minutes with the senior executives. They valued my input. They respected my boundaries. They paid me what I was worth. I walked toward the glass door of the conference room and caught my reflection. I didn't see the tired, frantic girl who used to braid hair with one hand and review homework with the other while fearing a power shut-off. I saw a woman who was no longer tired or afraid or burdened by guilt. I smiled at myself. It was a small, private smile. I had walked through the fire of family betrayal and emerged on the other side as polished steel. I had reclaimed my name. I had reclaimed my credit score. And most importantly, I had reclaimed my future from the people who tried to steal it. The elevator doors opened to reveal my colleagues waiting for me. "Ready, Miranda?" one of them asked. "I've never been more ready," I replied. I stepped forward into my new life without looking back. This story serves as a stark reminder to everyone listening. Shared DNA is never a valid justification for tolerating abuse or exploitation from the people who are supposed to love you. True family is built on mutual respect and support, not manipulation and parasitic demands that drain your spirit. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for your future is to establish an unbreakable boundary and walk away from those who refuse to value your worth. You are not a resource to be used. You are a person to be cherished. Thank you so much for accompanying Miranda on this difficult journey from being a victim of family exploitation to becoming the architect of her own freedom. Do you think she was right to cut off Jada and Grandma Lorraine completely? Or do you think she should have given them one more chance? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, resilience, and the power of saying no.